The villainous Lord Voldemort was once a poor, lonely orphan, but then so was Harry Potter. So what happened? NYU Langone Psychiatrist Dr. Karen Rosenbaum talks sociopaths and Lord Voldemort. Ahead on Science Goes to the Movies. Welcome to Science Goes to the Movies, a look at the stories of science and how they change our culture. I'm Lisa Beth Kovitz. Today we're joined by Dr. Karen Rosenbaum from NYU Langone's Department of Psychiatry, and we're going to take an in-depth look at Harry Potter's evil nemesis, Lord Voldemort. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Lord Voldemort's real name is Tom Marvolo Riddle, and he is damned from the start. His mother, Merope Gaunt, after a lifetime of abuse at the hands of her brother and father, is finally left to her own devices, and the first thing she does is slip a love potion to the local muggle heartthrob. They marry, and their child, Tom, is conceived and carried under a magic spell. And let's say this magical world really existed. These potions would be equivalent to chemistry, and a love potion would be a drug. In real life and in terms of Lord Voldemort, is a child who is early exposed to drugs in danger of rewiring his neurological network?
So in real life, if the mother is consuming drugs, the fetus might be exposed to the drugs in the womb, and definitely that would have an effect on the nervous system. In this case, it's Tom Riddle's father who consumed the love potion. So I think this says more about Merope Gaunt's character, and that she feels such low self-esteem that she needs a potion to get her man. And that might be contributed genetically, which we're going to talk about. But in terms of the actual drug that his father consumed, I'm not sure that it would have that much effect because it's the father and not the mother.
Voldemort is a direct descendant of Salazar Slytherin, a family so dedicated to blood purity and maintaining their secret snake language of Parselmouth that they married each other generation after generation, resulting in children prone to violence and depression. Using a real-life understanding of psychiatry, would generations of violence and generations of intermarriage affect a kid like Tom Riddle? Or does it all get wiped out as soon as she marries outside of her bloodline?
So even though she marries outside of her bloodline, he still has 50% of the genetic components from his mother. And sure, the generations of being prone to violence and depression can affect Tom Riddle. Also, we don't know that much about his father, but the fact that he left him without any regard for who he was or find out about him or come to the orphanage, I think there were multiple opportunities where the father could have found him, might show callousness on the part of the father, which might also affect, so he might have had some genetic issues on both sides.
Tom Riddle's mother, abused, addicted, and abandoned, dies just after his birth, leaving him in an orphanage. At this point in Rowling's opus, the villain, Voldemort, begins to parallel the life of the hero, Harry Potter. Harry Potter lives under the staircase at the Dursleys, and Tom Riddle grows up in that weird orphanage with the bathroom tiles on the walls. Harry Potter's childhood is full of constant abuse from the Dursleys, whereas Voldemort's bland orphanage seems to leave him alone. Very, very, very alone. Would the empty nothingness of Tom Riddle's orphanage be just as damaging as the abuse from the Dursleys?
Yes, and in fact, neglect and abuse are both forms of child maltreatment, and in some ways neglect could be considered to be worse or at least as bad as forms of physical abuse, because it's an omission, so the person isn't getting any of their basic needs met from a caretaker, so they wouldn't be able to form healthy attachments because there's just nobody. Whereas even though Harry is abused by the Dursleys, he had some early good childhood attachment from his caregivers, which might have protected him. And I think he can see how ridiculous the Dursleys are. And at least some of his basic needs are being met. He's clothed, he's going to school, he has a room, not a great one, and whereas Tom Riddle really doesn't seem to have anybody that's looking after him at all, and we don't even know about his peers in the orphanage.
So this character that we all hate, really as a child, he had no opportunity to develop the brain pathways that would give him any kind of structure even to rely on. Is that true?
Yes, I mean, in terms of if you look at it from an attachment perspective, he doesn't have any way to see what good role models are or bad role models are, and he has a very stark development. His mother dies as soon as he gets to the orphanage, and so there's this famous study by Harry Harlow where he took rhesus monkeys at the early days of life. He had wired mother figures and then other mother figures that he put terry cloth on top of. And the rhesus monkeys that were able to have the terry cloth mothers did a lot better. And he also found a critical period in the first 90 days of life where if they didn't have some soft emotional attachment figure, they could be permanently damaged. So for someone like Tom Riddle, who didn't have anyone at all in first year or the first 11 years, before Hogwarts, he would be pretty bad off.
Right, he's got bathroom tile.
Yeah, not
for a mother.
Yeah, not soft and warm in terry cloth. No.
No. How much does that first year of love matter in the development of these characters?
It's absolutely critical. So if, Harry's knowing that his parents loved him in the first year, even if he doesn't have a concrete memory of it, he has some implicit feeling knowledge of it because he had that early attachment, which wired his brain to have a secure attachment base, whereas somebody like Tom Riddle, who had nothing, not even anyone who stepped in as caregiver, that it seems he would maybe become more avoidant attachment style, which we see when Dumbledore comes to get him to Hogwarts. He offers him to go to Diagon Alley to get books with him, and he says, no, I can do it by myself. I can do everything by myself. And that's, that was his defense mechanism because he only had himself to rely on.
Do you see people like this in your practice, people who have this background?
I've seen people with childhood abuse and neglect, and it's very difficult because in the treatment relationship, it's affected often because they might not trust me or they might have concerns or fears, and their defense mechanism style or their use of their tools just aren't that good, and so sometimes they can't even benefit that well from therapy, so it's very difficult.
Because you've explained that absolutely in the book, people do reach out to him with love, but...
Sure, but it's by 11, it seems like it's probably too late.
Really?
If there were any other things, like if he had other attachment figures early in life or any examples of good moral behavior, he might have, even if that woman, Mrs. Cole, instead of letting him torture kids and animals, had stepped in, at least maybe he could have had some intellectual knowledge of what is right and wrong, but it seems like he was able to run amok.
Yeah, Miss Cole is the real villain of... As a modern person looking at this woman, you want to say, how could you?
Exactly.
This was your job.
Exactly.
Most of what we know about Lord Voldemort comes in book 6, Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, where we learn that as a kid, Voldemort tortured animals and set fires, 2 of the 3 traits that psychiatrist John Macdonald in 1963 declared to be predictive of later violent tendencies. What is the Macdonald Triad, and magic or not, has Macdonald's theory stood the test of time?
As psychiatrists, we really don't use that thought anymore, but the Macdonald Triad was bedwetting, fire starting, and cruelty to animals. That some of that has been debunked. Just because you do those things in childhood doesn't mean you're going to be an antisocial adult, but it does seem that most people who do become antisocial personality in adulthood, which is characterized by a blatant disregard for others, lack of empathy, lack of remorse, lack of attention to the law, those people may have had animal cruelty in their background, but not everybody who has conduct disorder, which is what we consider that to be if it's earlier than 15, develop antisocial personality disorder.
So people bedwet for all
Of
kinds
all
of reasons.
kinds, sure.
People set fire for all kinds of reasons.
Sure.
But what about that animal cruelty piece? Does that stand out amongst them?
I'd say of the three that does, because it just shows a lack of empathy because animals are so innocent. I mean, unless it's different circumstance, but it does set off alarm bells in us if somebody's being cruel to animals.
I think it's interesting when I was talking about this to very smart colleagues, they recognize the Macdonald Triangle, even though it doesn't exist anymore scientifically. They recognized it from movie tropes. They're like, oh yeah, that's how it works.
Interesting.
Because we're so affected by
What we see in the media, sure.
In Voldemort, Rowling writes an irredeemable character. But in real life, could Tom Riddle have been saved?
Sure, like if he had had a detachment figure that stepped in earlier, or somebody who cared, if his basic needs were met, which includes love and attention, he might have had a different outcome, just like Harry. But so many things were stacked against him. And then there is also the genetic predisposition that we talked about. So it would have been, even more imperative for someone to step in. So it's the nature-nurture question. It's both, but if there's no nurture available, then it's really impossible.
Would Voldemort be a terrifying client to have?
I think that somebody like Voldemort wouldn't come into my office on his own. He would be maybe mandated to my office after having some criminal activity, or as a forensic psychiatrist, I might be seeing him for his attorney to see if there's some mitigating circumstances. And that orphanage growing up could be considered a mitigating circumstance in his development because he had such an awful childhood, and like you said, that everything was stacked against him to become evil, but it doesn't really change that, his behavior is bad, and everything that he does at that point, if he feels the world is bad and he's suspicious of the world, the way he was suspicious of Dumbledore when he was 11, he thought Dumbledore was going to be there to take him to the asylum. He didn't believe that it was going to be, that he was really going to be at Hogwarts. And then, so he sees the world as bad, and then he might lash out at something he perceives as bad, and then people reinforce that worldview that people are bad because they're going to react badly to him, and then the cycle continues. And so, yes, it's difficult to get out of that cycle once you hit adulthood and you've done criminal activity.
That's just so tragic. It's so tragic.
It's really sad.
And unfair. It really makes you see why children need to really be taken care of, why we have to take care of everybody's children in a certain way.
Definitely. And really, that's what most of the criminal justice system is made up of. Almost everybody there has a horrible story.
There's a lot of debate all over the internet about which chapter of the APA's Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders should be devoted to Lord Voldemort. Sociopath, psychopath, narcissist, magical fascist. What do you think? What is he?
So the beauty of fictional characters is that we don't have to put them in a box. And in fact, in real life, we can't. It's difficult to put people in a box. We think of things more along a continuum. But just to explain some of those terms, a psychopath and a sociopath are both, they're not in the DSM-5, but they're both labels for antisocial personality disorder, which is in the DSM-5. And so it's not, there's some confusion among the terms because it's not that scientific, but both have the root in the blatant disregard for others, not caring about the law, lying, deceitfulness, impulsivity, irritability. You need 3 of those to be antisocial. And with the psychopath, they might have a little bit more of a cunning, manipulative quality. Think like Dexter, where he's very precise and people like him. He's charming, but yet he kills people. And then you have the sociopath, who is thought to be more impulsive, maybe more like the Joker and Batman. Like, you know he's scary, you stay away from him, he's less likely to draw you in.
Interesting.
Then you have the malignant narcissist, who Erich Fromm and then Otto Kernberg coined to be more of a mix of the narcissistic personality disorder that's in the DSM-5 and antisocial personality traits. So you have somebody who has the blatant disregard for others, lack of remorse, but you also have somebody who's very grandiose and has an inflated self-esteem and might on the root of it has a very fragile ego, and people often walk on eggshells around those people. Like if they say the wrong thing, the person will get narcissistically injured and then lash out. So I do see elements of that with Lord Voldemort, because you see in early childhood when as soon as Dumbledore tells him, you're special, you have magic, you can talk to snakes, he gets that's when he really is like, okay, I'll go to Hogwarts, like I knew I was special. That specialness is something he really needs, that and the immortality, which also I think could stem from narcissism, hence the Horcruxes.
Right.
And that fragile self-esteem ego, I mean, it couldn't be more blatant in the fact that his soul is split into 7 pieces, completely disintegrating his identity, and that way he can stay immortal, but also shows how fragile his identity, because when he talks to Slughorn about it, Slughorn's like, you don't really want to do that. It's against nature. You want to have an intact identity, and he doesn't have he doesn't even seem to comprehend that. So
in real life, the diagnosis is not discrete categories, it's a Venn diagram.
yes, a Venn diagram, I like, or a continuum, but I do like thinking about it in a Venn diagram.
Once and for all, let's put it to rest. What would you write in your notes about Tom Riddle?
I think he's in the middle of the Venn diagram, where he
dear.
has sociopathy, psychopathy, and malignant narcissism. But if you had a gun to my head, I would say the malignant narcissist is probably
or a wand
the closest.
to your head?
Or a wand. Then, I think because the malignant narcissist takes into account the psychopath and the narcissistic personality and accounts for that Venn diagram, I would say I could put him there.
I think that complexity really is a compliment to Rowling's writing.
Definitely. It's very impressive that she has that knowledge and didn't want to pigeonhole him into a box.
Right, right. Being a Death Eater seems like a miserable club that no one in their right mind would want to join, but then so does following Charles Manson. And here's a video of Hitler at the 1936 Olympics twitching and shaking like the speed freak he was. In hindsight, none of these people seem even remotely inviting. Do psychopaths have a magical power over their minions to keep them in line, to keep them following them?
No, I would say that it's more about the followers than the leader. I liked how Dumbledore put it, and I'm going to paraphrase, but he talked about the early Death Eaters at Hogwarts, and he said it was the weak who wanted a strong leader. He said it was the ambitious who wanted shared glory, and it was the thuggish who wanted somebody to show them new ways of cruelty, something like that. So yeah, I think in 1930s Nazi Germany, there were a lot of disenfranchised people who the country had been, really poor and decimated after World War I. So those people needed a strong leader, and they really grasped at the message of hate, or they could, relate it to the message of hate. But I don't think it was Hitler's magical power. Hitler could have been anybody in that position. It's more about the people.
We're just going to tiptoe a little bit into the play Harry Potter and the Cursed Child and do our best to keep the secret of the narrative as we're all instructed. But I'm pretty comfortable telling you that as the story of Harry Potter and his family continues, there's a child, and the child is cursed, mostly with being brought up with a set of values that are contrary to what both the wizarding world and most humans hold dear. So what happens to a person who is physically healthy, loved by their parents, but brought up in a world where Hitler is right, where KKK robes are actually sort of fashionable? How does that person reach normalcy?
So, I think it still bodes well for them to have the attachment figures that we talked about, and, you said they were, brought up in a happy household, just that the parents were, hated some group, which could be ignorance. And so if the child has other forms of educators, like at school or peers that have other messages, they might be able to also form their moral reasoning from those people.
So education and exposure are a big thing.
Big things. And let's say, it's a place where everybody's giving the child the same message, the parents, the teachers, the peers, the environment, then still, as long as there was not a lot of abuse or neglect and they had a pretty good childhood and loving caregivers, they'd still be able to have an opportunity once they leave that environment through education, through new exposure to new people, to, separate the ideas that were ingrained when they were a kid to maybe forming their own. That doesn't always happen because the person needs to be somewhat intelligent and still, have that other side and the willingness to see another side, but at least there's hope.
Is there a point that's too late? Do we? No.
No, I mean, I think, again, I think it's a different thing when we talked about too late as far as early attachment.
That's what I was thinking.
Versus somebody who's just surrounded by people who might be ignorant or have messages of hate but still feel loved.
Yeah.
I think it is a different thing. And I think with, Harry Potter, knowing that he was loved in that early period, again, that affected his worldview. So even though he had the Dursleys hating on him, there was something that protected him, where he could see that when he chose good behaviors, he would get positive regard, especially once he was at Hogwarts. And then, he could feel good about himself and continue to do good. Whereas the other cycle that we talked, the negative cycle, occurred with Voldemort, where he saw the world as evil and malicious, and he was suspicious of everybody, and anything he did, people looked at like, what are you doing? Right. He couldn't please Dumbledore no matter what he did, I think, is how he felt.
Well, he wanted to do evil things.
Correct. And so then the cycle continued. Though it seemed like he did charm some of the other professors, like Slughorn.
Yes.
He couldn't fool Dumbledore because Dumbledore knew, about his childhood. So it was a little bit of, even Dumbledore might have failed him in some regard by mirroring that early childhood version of Tom Riddle and maybe not stepping in as a father figure. I think Dumbledore even does say he could have done more.
Do you think, from the outside, did Dumbledore fail him?
I only just thought about it as I said it, but I think there could be an argument for that. Yes.
Yeah. He's a very flawed character.
He is.
Well, it's interesting because having failed Tom Riddle, his behavior towards Harry Potter is also something of a failure. He puts Potter through quite a lot of pain.
Yes, he puts a lot into Potter that seems to be unfair to do to a 10-year-old boy and 11-year-old boy and 12-year-old boy. Yes.
Well, a lot of these books it's a lot of pressure on little kids to save the world.
Yes.
I think that the books that I grew up with gave children an opportunity to be children in the books, but in these books, they all have to be superheroes. It's a lot of pressure for real children who can't break the laws of physics willy-nilly to have these kids as heroes.
I would agree with that. Yes, although it's also a good message of love and empowerment and women empowerment.
Yes.
I think Hermione is a great character for women.
She is. So. Yeah. Harry Potter's most magical power, the thing that trumps Voldemort's evil again and again, is the power of love. And love may seem like a non-specific piece of magic, but the feeling of love results in actions that have significant effect, especially on a growing child. In real-world science, how important is Harry Potter's capacity to love? I
think it's very important. I think that his capacity to love and that what he brought from, even that very early childhood, knowing his parents loved him, being told over and over again he was loved, really helped him to choose love over and over again, because he was faced with some of the same choices as Voldemort, and he was able to choose the good path or the moral path. Not every time. Sometimes he got angry and did things like blow up an ant, but no, other than that, he, he chose a path of love, and I think there are a lot of scientific papers about the power of love that can really help with moral reasoning and success in adulthood.
And as a professional, can you get that into a client? Can you get that into your profession? How?
Sure. I mean,
Or is it magic?
There could be a magical component, but in the therapy session is like a microcosm of the real world, and sometimes, yes, you're representing that there can be love in the world, especially with somebody who grew up without really knowing that and is suspicious of that. And if in the therapy you can have a reconstructive experience, then that's great.
Just like a rehearsal or a test of how you could do it in the real world in your therapy session.
Sure.
Oh, that's so great. That's so great. Karen, thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.